The U.S. government had repeatedly violated treaties with Dakota by not paying or paying annuity payments late. This caused hunger and hardship among the Dakota Indians. Traders refused to trade with the Dakota on credit. On August 17, 1862, one young Dakota killed 5 settlers while on a hunting expedition. Dakota attacked white settlements throughout the Minnesota River Valley to drive them out, killing around 800, including women and children. A short war ensued, resulting in the capture of more than 1,000 Dakota, the hanging of 38, and the abolition of their reservation. They were forced to move to Nebraska and South Dakota. When white settlers discovered gold in Montana in the early 1860s, they began to build a road from Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming to the gold fields. They also constructed a series of forts to protect the road, which became known as the Bozeman Trail. Starting in 1865, Red Cloud led the Oglala and the Cheyenne in a war against white soldiers, miners, and settlers on the Bozeman Trail. After a 2-year fight, Red Cloud and his soldiers forced the U.S. to abandon its forts and stop building the road. This is known as Red Cloud's War. As a result of Red Cloud's War, the United States signs the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. It gave the Black Hills back to the Sioux Indians, and it also closed off white settlement in the northern plains. Several Indian tribes decided to voluntarily move to reservations to try and ensure the Sioux civilization's survival. They learned to farm, blacksmith, be carpenters, engineering, and learn more of the English language. Gold was then discovered in the Black Hills, bringing a large migration of whites. This led to another conflict. In 1877, the Black Hills were taken by the U.S. government. In 1980 and 1989, the U.S. offered to pay the Sioux for the Black Hills, but the Sioux refused payment. The Black Hills of Dakota are sacred to the Sioux Indians. In the 1868 treaty signed at Fort Laramie and other military posts in Sioux country, the U.S. recognized the Black Hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation, set aside for exclusive use by the Sioux people. In 1874, however, General George A. Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills accompanied by miners who were seeking gold. Once gold was found in the Black Hills, miners were soon moving into the Sioux hunting grounds and demanding protection from the U.S. Army. Soon the Army was ordered to move against the wandering bands of Sioux hunting on the range in accordance with their treaty rights. Actions by the U.S. government led to a series of conflicts known as the Indian Wars. Let's start first with the Sand Creek Massacre. Colorado militia massacred an encampment of Cheyenne women, children, and men in 1864. In 1876, General George Custer, leading an Army detachment, encountered the encampment of Sioux and Cheyenne at the Little Bighorn River. Custer's detachment was annihilated, but the United States would continue its battle against the Sioux in the Black Hills until the government takes the land in 1877. Earlier in 1877, the U.S. government broke a land treaty with the Nez Perce, forcing the group out of their homeland in the Northwest for relocation to Idaho. In the midst of their journey, Chief Joseph learned that 3 young warriors, enraged at the loss of their homeland, had massacred a band of white settlers. Fearing retaliation by the U.S. Army, the chief began one of the greatest retreats in American military history. For more than 3 months, Chief Joseph led fewer than 300 Nez Perce Indians toward the Canadian border, covering a distance of more than 1,000 miles, as they outmaneuvered and battled more than 2,000 pursuing U.S. soldiers. During the long retreat, he treated prisoners humanely and won the admiration of whites by purchasing supplies along the way rather than stealing them. Finally, only 40 miles short of his Canadian goal, at Bear Paw Mountain in Montana, Chief Joseph was cornered by the U.S. Army, and his people were forcibly relocated to a barren reservation in Indian Territory. At the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890, over 200 Native American men, women, and children were gunned down by the U.S. Army. It marks the official end of the Indian Wars. The ghost dance was also part of Indian culture. It is a cult that tried to call the spirits of past warriors to inspire the young braves to fight. It was crushed at the Battle of Wounded Knee after spreading to the Dakota Sioux. The ghost dance led to the Dawes Act of 1887. This act tried to reform Indian tribes and turn them into white citizens. Indian boarding schools were established in the U.S. during the late 1800s. with the goal of assimilating Native American children and youth into mainstream American culture, while at the same time providing a basic American education. These boarding schools were first established by various Christian missionaries, who often started schools on reservations, especially in the lightly populated areas of the West. The government paid religious groups to provide a basic education to these children on reservations. Children were typically immersed in American culture through forced changes that removed elements of their native culture. They were forced to cut their hair short, were forbidden to speak their languages, and had their real names replaced by European names to both civilize and Christianize them. They wore military-style uniforms as well. The experience of the schools was usually harsh and sometimes deadly, especially for younger children who were forcibly separated from their families. The assimilation policy of the federal government was facilitated by the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, which broke up reservation system and gave tribal lands of 160 acres to each head of household. If they stayed on the land for 25 years and became civilized, they would be granted citizenship. The lands that didn't go to Indian families were sold to speculators, which was often the best land. The money was used to create schools for Indians to Americanize them. This failed. By the end of the century, the Indian population had dwindled down to 200,000 people, many who lived with disease and poverty. Geronimo was an Apache leader and medicine man, best known for his fearlessness in resisting anyone, Mexican or American, who attempted to remove his people from their tribal lands. He repeatedly evaded capture and life on a reservation, and during his final escape, a full quarter of the U.S. standing army pursued him and his followers. When Geronimo was captured on September 4, 1886, he was the last Native American leader to formally surrender to the U.S. military. He spent the last 20 years of his life as a prisoner of war. The Plains Indians were warriors and hunters, but were eventually defeated. There were several reasons why they lost to a relatively weak U.S. Army. First, the Army was professionally trained. They could coordinate their attacks and often outnumbered their Indian adversaries. Next, the railroad provided supplies and reinforcements that contributed to the Army's superiority. Communication was vital to winning the Indian Wars. The telegraph, which had been brought west along with the railroad, helped the U.S. government coordinate their attacks against Indian tribes. The U.S. Army also had superior weapons. New guns, like the repeating revolver and the Winchester rifle, were more accurate and could fire more shots than older rifles. Finally, the invention of the Gatling gun made killing more efficient. It could fire multiple rounds at a high rate, leading to more killing. Joseph Glidden will develop the barbed wire in 1874. Barbed wire made fencing cheap and possible in a region without trees. Barbed wire also kept animals fenced in and kept them from eating crops. Farmers struggled with the hard soil of the Great Plains. Centuries of buffalo stampeding the sod packed into solid land fooled settlers into thinking the land was inhospitable to agriculture. They just needed something strong enough to plow the land. When farmers started using the steel plow, developed in 1837, pulled by 4 oxen, they found that the Great Plains could be great for farming, but they still needed water. The steel windmill will allow farmers to drill hundreds of feet below their land for drinking and irrigation. The Industrial Revolution allowed the development of mega farms. Machines like the combine allowed farmers to reap far more crops than they would be able to individually. Technology innovation helped farming on the frontier. The railroads helped to get people and goods to and from the West Coast to the East Coast. A railhead was a terminus where the railroad met a different mode of transportation, like a port, or where different railroads connect to one major one. Refrigerated railway cars would allow the meat to stay fresh and keep it from spoiling. We already talked about barbed wire, steel windmills, and steel plows. The reaper harvests the grain from the field. The thresher separates the grain from the stems and the husks. The combine is actually a combination of the reaper and the thresher. And tractors were also available to move heavy equipment in trailers. 3 major events marked the closing of the frontier. The first one's the Apache Wars. The U.S. inherited this conflict when Mexico ceded control of the territory in 1848. American citizens began encroaching on Apache lands to raise livestock, crops, and mine minerals. The U.S. Army, to control the Apache, built forts and reservations. After several years of conflicts, the U.S. Army wore them down and accepted the surrender of Geronimo and his followers. This marks the last major American Indian leader to surrender to U.S. forces. In 1889, the federal government opened unassigned lands in Oklahoma for settlement. An estimated 50,000 people lined up for a chance at over 2 million acres of land. Unassigned lands were considered some of the best unoccupied public land in the U.S. Several people who participated in the run entered the unoccupied land early and hid there until the legal time of entry to lay quick claim to some of the best homesteads. These people came to be identified as Sooners. This led to hundreds of legal contests that arose and were decided first at local land offices and eventually by the U.S. Department of the Interior. Finally, the 1890 census was a significant census for several reasons. First, it showed the U.S. population had grown by 25%. It was the first census tabulated by a machine. It also signified the disappearance of the American frontier. And finally, it was the first census where a majority of the states recorded populations of over 1 million.